April 12, 1945. The East China Sea boiled beneath a low gray sky. 48 men were sealed inside the USS Harder, one of America's most feared destroyer-killer subs. They'd been hunting Japanese convoys for weeks, exhausted, soaked in diesel, and running low on torpedoes. Sonar pings echoed through the pressure hull, distant at first, then multiplying. The operator froze. Multiple screws. Fast approach. Commander Sam Lewis leaned over the plotting table, tracing the bearing lines that were converging on their position. 4 destroyers. A hunter pack. The crew had minutes, maybe less. Standard doctrine said dive deep, go silent, survive. Lewis didn't move. He'd seen this trick before. Destroyers running in staggered arcs, forcing submarines to exhaust their air and batteries before surfacing into gunfire. There would be no escape that way. He gave a quiet order. Prepare forward tubes 1 through 4. We'll attack from periscope depth. The diving officer hesitated. Sir, they'll spot us. Then we'll be faster than their eyes. Lewis cut him off. The submarine rose to 50 feet. Rain hammered the periscope lens as the sea churned around them. The destroyers were closing from the north, their propellers beating through the water like drums of war. No sane commander surfaced into that kind of kill zone. But Lewis wasn't sane anymore. He was tired of running, tired of losing friends to ships that never stopped hunting. The crew felt it too, terror mixing with defiance. At 3:14 a.m., the USS Harder broke through the waves. Deck awash, hatches sealed, torpedoes armed. The Japanese lookouts never expected it. A submarine rising into gunfire, it looked suicidal. And that was exactly the point. The Harder had been patrolling the East China Sea for 19 straight days, stalking the last arteries that fed the Imperial Japanese Navy. By April 1945, the American blockade had tightened like a noose, choking every supply line between Formosa, Okinawa, and the home islands. This narrow corridor, 100 miles wide, shallow, and crawling with destroyers, was Japan's final lifeline to fuel and ammunition. Whoever held it would decide how long the war at sea could continue. Commander Lewis understood that reality better than anyone aboard. He had read the decrypted radio traffic from Tokyo, orders instructing destroyer captains to form hunting packs and sweep every sound contact until nothing remained but oil and debris. These were veterans of the Philippine Sea, trained to sense weakness and armed with the latest Type 93 long lance torpedoes, capable of killing a sub even at a mile's distance. In that deadly chess game, silence was survival. But Harder had been silent for too long. The submarine's record was already legend among Allied crews. She had sunk 10 enemy warships in less than a year, earning the name Destroyer Killer from the very men who watched her disappear into the waves. Yet each victory had carved deeper scars into her steel hull and into the faces of the men inside. Every dive meant leaking valves, groaning bulkheads, and the constant taste of battery acid in the recycled air. They knew the odds. A single depth charge within 50 yards could rupture the pressure hull and crush them flat before anyone could scream. Still, Lewis refused to retreat to deep water. His orders were to hold the corridor, to make the Japanese believe the passage was haunted by an invisible predator. If they could keep the destroyers chasing ghosts here, the convoys bound for Okinawa would sail safely through the southern lanes. 1 submarine, 5 torpedoes left, against an entire hunter group. It wasn't strategy. It was sacrifice disguised as duty. Inside the dim red light of the control room, the men whispered the same question they'd asked for days. Why are we still here? No one dared say the answer out loud. Lewis had lost 2 crewmen in the last engagement, and their bunks remained untouched, boots still strapped to the pipes overhead. The Harder was running on vengeance now, a machine powered by ghosts and fear. Outside, the sea churned with the sound of approaching screws. The Japanese destroyers were closing in, fast, confident, and blind, believing the American sub had already fled into the depths. Lewis traced their course one last time, then looked at his helmsman. "We hold this line," he said quietly, "until they remember why they feared us." And as the enemy formation crossed into range, the Harder turned her bow toward them, one steel predator facing the Empire's last heartbeat. The first contact came just before dawn, when the sea turned the color of cold iron and the wind shifted from the west. The sonar man pressed his headset tighter, counting the beats of each propeller blade until the rhythm formed a pattern only trained ears could decode. 4 destroyers, spaced in a fan, sweeping the corridor like wolves driving prey toward the waiting guns of the fleet. The Harder drifted at periscope depth, her engines silent, her crew holding their breath as if exhaling might give them away. Through the narrow periscope lens, Lewis saw the silhouettes cutting across the horizon, gray hulls slicing through the mist. Their wakes glowed faintly in the pale light, marking the path of death that closed in with every second. He whispered for a bearing check, his voice calm but stretched thin like wire. The helmsman repeated the numbers, hands trembling on the wheel, and the navigator plotted the intercept course with a pencil worn down to a stub. Every man in the control room knew that one mistake, even the scrape of a wrench against metal, could summon the storm. The Japanese ships were broadcasting active sonar now, bursts of sound that rolled through the water like thunder, slamming against the submarine's hull and bouncing back distorted. Each ping was a heartbeat, each echo a reminder that the hunters were growing closer. One officer muttered a prayer beneath his breath. Another reached for a cigarette, then stopped midway, realizing that even a spark could betray them through the ventilation. The air was thick with oil and fear, the kind of tension that bends time until seconds stretch into hours. Lewis watched the rangefinder needle quiver, then settle. 1,000 yards and closing, he said. The words carried through the cramped space like a verdict. He could see the nearest destroyer's bow gun now, its barrel glistening with salt spray, its crew unaware that a steel shadow lurked beneath their keel. The Americans waited for the order, muscles locked, sweat rolling down, faces that looked more like wax than flesh. "Open outer doors 1 through 4, Lewis commanded, and the mechanical whine of hydraulics filled the sub with a slow, dreadful hum. Water gurgled into the tubes, as if the ocean itself were holding its breath. The crosshairs on the periscope steadied over the lead destroyer's hull, perfectly centered on the forward magazine. The enemy vessel turned slightly, exposing its flank, unaware of the danger rising from below. Lewis spoke again, barely more than a whisper. "Fire 1. A jolt ran through the deck as compressed air expelled the first torpedo into the sea, followed by 3 more in quick succession. The crew felt the vibration but heard nothing. Sound underwater moved faster than fear itself. Lewis dropped the periscope and ordered, "Down periscope, dive to 90 feet. The Harder slipped beneath the surface, just as the first explosion ripped through the dawn, a roar so deep it seemed to split the ocean in half. The Japanese had found their prey, but too late. The shock wave from the explosion rolled through the hull like a hammer striking a bell, rattling every pipe, gauge, and rib of the Harder until the steel itself seemed to groan in pain. The men were thrown against bulkheads, their ears ringing, lights flickering from red to black as circuit breakers tripped one by one. Somewhere aft, a valve blew, spewing a thin mist of steam that turned the control room into a ghostly fog. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Only the deep rumble of the ocean pressed against their ears like a warning. Then the second detonation came closer this time, sharper, a direct hit somewhere near the stern planes. The Harder heaved upward, lost buoyancy, and began to tilt at an angle that made the deck feel like a collapsing stairwell. The helmsman slammed the dive controls forward, shouting numbers that disappeared under the wail of claxons. 40 degrees down bubble pressure, rising 70 feet, 80-90. The crew clung to pipes, faces slick with sweat and salt water, waiting for the next blow that might tear the submarine in half. Lewis steadied himself on the periscope column, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Hold her level, blow ballast 2 and 3. Keep us at 100 feet. The chief of the boat yanked open the valves, and compressed air roared through the tanks, forcing the submarine to shudder and level off. The lights blinked back to life, dim and sickly yellow. Water sloshed across the floor, carrying with it shards of broken gauges and a spreading film of hydraulic oil that smelled like burning metal. Reports came in fast stern torpedo room flooding, aft batteries offline, pressure hull dented but intact. 2 men injured, 1 burned from the ruptured line. The medic crawled through the compartment, wrapping hands and arms in gauze that instantly turned red. Lewis listened without blinking, nodding once, already plotting his next move on the wet chart table. The Japanese destroyers were circling overhead now, dropping depth charges in measured intervals, like a drumbeat, counting down the seconds of their survival. Each detonation lifted the submarine a few inches, slammed it back down, then followed with a long moan as the hull flexed under the pressure. Dust fell like snow from the ceiling. Someone began whispering the Lord's Prayer, another muttered the names of his children, and somewhere behind them the hull let out a long metallic shriek that silenced everyone at once. The noise meant the steel was close to yielding. Lewis didn't pray. He stared at the depth gauge creeping toward 120 feet and felt the weight of the Pacific pressing against every inch of the ship. "We're not dying down here," he said quietly. "Not today." He ordered the engines to half power, trimming the ballast to keep the boat suspended in a narrow band between darkness and light. Above them, the destroyers prowled like sharks, circling the wounded sub, convinced the kill was certain. But inside the Harder, through the smoke, sweat, and fear, something had changed. The men had seen death pass close enough to touch, and decided it wasn't taking them yet. The Harder drifted wounded and half-blind beneath the waves, her gauges trembling, her hull creaking like an old ship's bones under a mountain of water. The crew waited in a tense, exhausted silence, listening to the enemy destroyers comb the sea above them with deliberate, merciless precision. Each ping from their sonar struck the submarine's shell like a hammer on a coffin lid, counting down the seconds until they would be found and finished. Every instinct screamed to dive deeper, to run silent, to hide in the cold black where even light could not reach. But Lewis knew that hiding now meant dying slowly. Their stern planes were damaged, their batteries leaking acid, and the oxygen scrubbers already struggling to keep up. The air was growing thick and metallic, the smell of sweat and diesel fusing into something that tasted like rust. The destroyers were closing their circle, boxing the submarine into a patch of shallow water where escape would be impossible. For most commanders, that would have been the end. For Lewis, it was only the beginning of something far more dangerous. He studied the navigation chart spread across the table, tracing a finger over a narrow trench that cut through the seabed like a scar. If he could lure the destroyers toward that channel and rise beneath them at the perfect angle, the Harder might deliver one last strike before they were sunk. It was suicide disguised as strategy, the kind of decision that belonged in a legend, not a manual. He looked around the control room, saw the faces of men who already knew they were living on borrowed minutes, and realized that they deserved more than a slow death in the dark. Lewis took a breath, steady and deliberate. "We're going back up," he said. A few heads turned, disbelief flickering behind salt-stung eyes. The executive officer started to protest, but Lewis raised a hand. "If we stay down here, the pressure will kill us before they do. If we surface, at least we fight." His tone carried no madness, only clarity, the kind that comes when a man accepts his fate and chooses how to meet it. The order spread through the compartments like a current. Men strapped themselves into positions, checked valves, tightened bolts, and whispered quiet farewells to no one in particular. The chief engineer reprimed the ballast pumps with a single muttered word, "Aye." The diving officer's hands shook as he reset the gauges, but his voice was steady when he called out, "Blow main ballast." The submarine began to rise, slowly at first, then faster, its damaged hull trembling as compressed air forced the sea out of its tanks. Above, the sonar pings quickened, the destroyers had caught the movement and were turning toward the sound. Lewis gripped the periscope column and stared into the darkness above them, waiting for the first shaft of dawn to filter through the green water. When it came, he gave his final command. Surface, battle stations. The Harder surged upward like a wounded predator, returning to the hunt, defying every rule written for men who wished to live. And for the first time that night, the crew stopped being afraid they were too busy becoming immortal. The Harder broke through the surface just as dawn tore a thin red line across the eastern horizon, its steel hull rising out of the water like a ghost reborn from the deep. Salt spray lashed across the bridge as Lewis and his men flung open the hatches, the freezing air flooding into the compartments like a baptism. Above them, the Japanese destroyers reacted in shock, their lookouts shouting warnings in panic, unable to comprehend that the submarine they had been hunting was now charging directly at them on the surface. Lewis climbed to the conning tower, eyes narrowed against the wind, his soaked uniform clinging to his frame as he raised his binoculars toward the nearest destroyer. The vessel was barely a mile away, its deck guns already rotating to bear, but the sudden appearance of the Harder had thrown the formation into chaos. Two ships turned sharply to avoid collision, cutting across each other's sonar beams and blinding their own attack pattern. In that moment of confusion, Lewis saw a narrow window, a fraction of time when courage outweighed physics. "Bring her about," he shouted over the storm, voice raw but unbroken. "Steady on 095. Prepare forward tubes." The helmsman spun the wheel, the submarine's bow carving through the churning water as the torpedo crew loaded the last of the Mark 14 seconds by hand, their bodies moving in rhythm with the pounding sea. Inside the control room, the air vibrated with the hum of engines pushed beyond their limit, the smell of burning oil mixing with the ozone tang of electricity. The Harder was no longer a machine. It was a heartbeat made of metal and fury. The Japanese destroyers recovered quickly, their gunners tracking the rising sub with precision honed through years of relentless war. Shells began to fall around them, geysers of water exploding within yards of the hull, each one hammering the deck like an invisible fist. Shrapnel ripped across the conning tower, slicing through railings and tearing holes in the radio antenna. One fragment caught the signalman across the shoulder, spinning him to the deck, but he still reached up to hoist the battle flag, a simple gesture that made every man on board stand taller. Lewis steadied himself against the periscope column, his voice a calm line cutting through the storm. Set depth 10 feet. Target the lead destroyer, second ship bearing left. Fire when ready. The torpedo officer's hands trembled as he pressed the firing key, and the deck shuddered as compressed air hurled steel death into the sea. 1, 2, 3 torpedoes streaked away, leaving white trails that vanished beneath the surface. The first destroyer saw the wakes too late. The torpedoes struck amidships, detonating in a single thunderous flash that lifted the vessel clear of the water before tearing it in half. A wall of flame and smoke rolled across the horizon, painting the morning sky with fire. The shockwave hit the Harder seconds later, rocking her sideways but leaving her afloat, her crew shouting in disbelief and triumph. Lewis didn't celebrate. He wiped the salt from his eyes and watched the remaining destroyers regroup, their guns flashing in fury. He knew this victory was only the beginning, and the ocean around them would soon turn from blue to red. But for now, the impossible had happened. The hunted had become the hunter, and the legend of the destroyer killer had just begun its final chapter. On the bridge of the nearest Japanese destroyer, the lookout's scream shattered the morning calm as the burning silhouette of their sister ship folded into the sea. The captain's first instinct was disbelief. Submarines did not surface into open gunfire, and none had ever survived doing so. Yet the evidence burned before him, columns of flame licking at the sky, the echo of secondary explosions rolling across the waves like thunder. For a heartbeat, the crew froze, unable to reconcile what they were seeing with everything they had been taught about naval warfare. Then training took over. Orders erupted in a chorus of shouted Japanese, men sprinting across the decks as gunners swung their barrels toward the impossible target that refused to die. The Harder was a dark smudge on the horizon, low and fast, its deck awash in spray as it cut through the waves like a blade. Shells began to fall around it again, precise and furious, but the sub weaved and rolled, its movements erratic, unpredictable, like a wounded predator that refused to sink. The destroyer captains adjusted formation, their radio operators screaming coordinates over static, but the American vessel was already too close. Through binoculars, one Japanese officer watched as the submarine's periscope mast tilted slightly, aligning perfectly with their lead destroyer. He shouted a warning, but the words vanished under the next explosion. A torpedo slammed into the destroyer's bow, detonating with such force that it lifted the forward deck clear off its keel. For a moment, the massive ship seemed to hang, suspended between air and water before splitting apart, fire bursting through its hull seams like molten veins. Men were thrown overboard, their cries lost in the roar of collapsing metal. The remaining destroyers tried to encircle the submarine, but every maneuver met chaos. One vessel turned too sharply, striking debris and damaging its own propeller. Another fired depth charges too early, the blasts erupting harmlessly behind the wake of the retreating Harder. The Japanese commanders shouted into their radios, voices cracking with rage and disbelief, demanding explanations from subordinates who could no longer think clearly. Nothing in the manuals had prepared them for a submarine that attacked upward, daring them to shoot faster than they could comprehend. From the bridge of the Harder, Lewis watched the destruction through smoke-stung eyes, expression unreadable as flames consumed the enemy ships. He could see the faces of men on the nearest destroyer, silhouettes outlined against the burning sky, confused, terrified, and utterly unprepared for the madness they were witnessing. His crew stared too, their triumph tempered by the realization that they were witnessing something beyond battle, something closer to myth. One Japanese officer later wrote in his report that it was as if the sea itself had turned against us. To the Imperial Navy, the event defied reason. A wounded submarine surfacing into their guns and emerging victorious could not be explained by logic or training. Rumors spread within hours. Some said it was a decoy. Others claimed it was piloted by ghosts of lost sailors. Whatever they believed, one truth remained. For the first time in the war, Japanese destroyer crews feared the sound of silence beneath the waves. And as the Harder slipped back into the smoke, its engines humming low and steady, the hunters who had ruled the sea now trembled in disbelief, watching their own doctrine sink with the wreckage of their fleet. The ocean was still burning when Lewis ordered the Harder to dive, her hull sliding beneath a surface littered with drifting oil and debris. The men worked in near silence, their hands blackened, their lungs aching from smoke and cordite. But none dared pause. Every movement felt mechanical, now trained, deliberate, born from the rhythm of survival. They knew the Japanese destroyers would recover soon, regroup, and unleash everything they had left. The submarine's only chance lay in using the chaos above as camouflage, vanishing into the very flames she had created. As the sub descended, the sound of the surface battle grew muffled, fading into the steady hum of engines and the soft creak of stressed metal. The sonar operator's voice broke the tension. "New contact bearing 168, fast mover." Lewis leaned over the chart table, tracing the contact's approach vector. It was one of the remaining destroyers, accelerating straight through the wreckage, intent on revenge. Its depth charges could still reach them if it closed the distance before they leveled off. "Hold depth at 100 feet, Lewis ordered. "Let them come closer." The crew exchanged quick glances, unsure if they had misheard. Allowing a destroyer to approach was suicide, but Lewis had already done the math in his head. The water here was shallow, the seabed uneven. A perfectly timed counterattack could trap the enemy ship between the pressure wave of its own explosives and the seabed below, magnifying the force of every blast. He would use their aggression against them. The sonar pings grew louder, faster, sharper, the hunter charging blind. The Japanese captain must have believed the submarine crippled, easy prey for his vengeance. His ship surged forward, propellers tearing through the slick of burning oil, weapons ready to drop. Lewis waited, watching the depth gauge as the sound intensified. Every ping slammed into the hull like a hammer blow, a countdown to destruction. At precisely the right moment, Lewis gave the order. "Up periscope. Flood forward tubes. Set depth 15 feet. Fire 2. The periscope broke the surface for less than a second, enough to capture a blurred glimpse of the destroyer's bow charging straight toward them. 2 torpedoes streaked upward, invisible under the boiling sea, guided by instinct and mathematics more than sight. Seconds later, the water erupted. The first torpedo struck directly beneath the forward magazine, detonating with a violence that lifted the destroyer from the water and snapped its spine. The second hit just aft, breaking the ship in two as fire roared through its decks. The blast sent shockwaves racing outward, slamming into the Harder and tilting her violently to port. Inside, men were thrown from their stations, tools clattering across the floor, pipes groaning as the pressure reverberated through the steel. When the turbulence subsided, the sonar went quiet. Only the hiss of escaping air filled the compartment. Lewis exhaled slowly, wiping soot from his face with a trembling hand. Around him, the crew stared in disbelief, the reality of what they had done settling over them like a weight heavier than the sea itself. Above them, the last enemy ship burned alone on the horizon. Below, the Harder steadied her course, battered but alive, her victory absolute. For the first time in 4 years of relentless war, the Japanese Navy's destroyer hunters had been hunted, and the ocean itself bore witness to the shift. From that moment forward, the tide no longer belonged to the Empire, it belonged to the silence beneath it. For the next 4 days, the Harder moved like a phantom through the East China Sea, her engines whispering just below the edge of hearing, her wake vanishing in the mist before the sun could touch it. Each morning brought another hunt, another impossible victory that defied both logic and chance. What had begun as a desperate act of defiance became a pattern, a rhythm of steel and fire that no enemy could predict. The submarine that should have been destroyed on the first day now carved a trail of wreckage across an empire's final sea. On the second day, they found a convoy steaming north toward Okinawa, 3 escort ships, and a transport heavy with ammunition. Lewis tracked them from 30 miles away, stalking the formation through the thin static of sonar echoes that rolled like thunder across the seabed. The crew worked in near silence, communicating through nods and hand signals, their movements practiced and instinctive. At dawn, the Harder rose to periscope depth, firing 2 torpedoes that hit the lead escort amidships. The explosion lit the sea in orange and black, and before the others could react, a third torpedo found the transport's magazine, tearing it apart in a storm of fire. When the smoke cleared, the ocean was empty again, save for burning debris drifting toward the horizon. The third day brought pursuit. Japanese aircraft scoured the sea, their bombs falling blind across empty water as the Harder lay hidden beneath a thermal layer, motionless for 8 hours, while the crew breathed through recycled air, thick with oil and fear. Men fainted at their posts, revived only by the medics' shaking hands and whispered curses. Yet when night came, the sub rose once more, its deck glistening under starlight, its commander scanning the black horizon for movement. Somewhere out there, more convoys were fleeing north, and Lewis intended to find them before dawn. The fourth day began with rain, a relentless, cold downpour that turned the sea into a mirror of shifting silver. It was in that storm that the Harder struck for the final time. A destroyer squadron escorting 2 supply ships appeared through the haze, unaware that the predator they thought dead was waiting beneath them. Lewis ordered a slow ascent, aligning the periscope with the convoy's centerline. The crew loaded the last of their torpedoes, each man working in silence, aware this would be their final shot. "Fire 1, fire 2, Lewis said, his voice steady, his eyes fixed on the blurred shapes above. 2 trails of white foam raced toward their targets. Moments later, the sea split open. The first destroyer vanished in a flash so bright it turned night to day. The second tried to turn away, but the blast from the sinking ship's boilers caught its stern, folding it like paper. The final torpedo struck the remaining supply ship dead center, erupting in a bloom of fire that spread across the rain-soaked sea like molten glass. When the echoes faded, 5 warships lay beneath the waves, their wreckage smoldering in the gray dawn. The Harder drifted among them, her engines silent, her crew staring through the periscope at what no one could believe. 5 ships in 4 days, a feat unmatched by any submarine in the Pacific War. In that silence, even the sea seemed to hold its breath, as if recognizing that a legend had just been written in fire and salt. By the 5th morning, the ocean was quiet again, its surface smoothed by wind and ash, as if trying to erase what had happened. The Harder drifted beneath that calm, moving slowly eastward toward deeper water, her hull scarred, her compartments leaking in places where the weld seams had stretched to their limit. The men were exhausted beyond words, throats raw from the staleness of recycled air, eyes red from 4 sleepless nights, but none of them dared rest. They all felt it now, an invisible weight pressing in from every side, the sense that the sea was watching. Lewis sat alone at the navigation table, his logbook open to a page half soaked with condensation. The pencil marks swam slightly as the sub rocked in the gentle swell. He wrote the same sentence twice before stopping to stare at the chart. 5 ships in 4 days, more tonnage than any submarine had ever destroyed in a single patrol. But as he looked at the thin blue lines marking their route, he realized the same track also marked their grave. They had crossed the enemy's heart, and there was no easy way back. At 9:46 a.m., Sonar reported faint echoes, 2 fast-moving contacts approaching from the northwest. The operator's voice cracked, unsure whether it was distant merchant traffic or destroyers returning for revenge. Lewis didn't hesitate. "Rig for silent running," he said quietly. The order carried through the compartments like a whisper. Engines cut to idle, pumps slowed, every man froze in place, listening to the rhythmic ping of sonar growing sharper with each pulse. Minutes stretched like hours. The destroyer's propellers beat through the water, methodical and patient, tracing circles that closed tighter around the submarine's estimated position. Lewis studied the depth gauge, 80 feet, descending slowly. They could dive deeper, but every foot meant greater pressure on the damaged hull, and he could already hear the faint groan of metal under strain. For once, the ocean felt less like a refuge and more like a tomb waiting to close. "Hold depth," he ordered. "Don't move, don't breathe." The crew obeyed. For a moment, the only sound was the distant hum of the enemy above. Then came the first explosion, a single depth charge, far away but terrifying in its promise. The second was closer, rattling tools loose from the racks. The third slammed directly above them, and the lights flickered out, plunging the Harder into darkness. Somewhere aft, a valve ruptured, spraying water in a thin, hissing arc. The chief engineer scrambled to close it, his hands bleeding on the wheel. Another explosion followed, and the deck lurched, pitching men to the floor. The hull shuddered violently, the groan turning into a high metallic scream that silenced every prayer left in their throats. Then, suddenly, there was quiet again. No sonar, no engines, no movement except the soft crackle of air bubbles rising toward the surface. Above, the Japanese destroyers circled once, twice, and then turned away, leaving behind only a widening patch of oil and smoke. No wreck was ever found. No signal was ever received. The Harder and her 48 men simply vanished into the deep, claimed by the same sea they had ruled. Sailors who passed through the area months later swore they heard distant knocking through the hulls of their ships like echoes from somewhere far below. And even now, on calm nights in the East China Sea, fishermen speak of lights flickering beneath the water, steady, rhythmic, and impossibly alive. In the months that followed, the Navy waited for word that never came. The Harder was listed overdue and presumed lost, her final coordinates marked in ink on a chart that soon gathered dust inside a locked cabinet at Pearl Harbor. For weeks, Radio operators scanned the static-filled frequencies of the Pacific, hoping for a faint Morse signal that might confirm she was still alive somewhere out there in the endless blue. But the ocean remained silent, holding its secrets close. Families received telegrams typed in identical language, formal, restrained, and heartbreakingly cold. Missing in action, presumed sunk. Yet, across the sea, something extraordinary was happening. Japanese naval archives, recovered after the war, began to reveal fragments of the truth. In declassified reports found in Yokosuka, officers described an American submarine that surfaced under heavy fire, struck with suicidal precision, and vanished amid multiple explosions. Another entry, dated April 16th, recorded 5 confirmed sinkings within 4 days in the East China Sea, each aligning perfectly with the Harder's last known patrol grid. The Japanese had given the unknown vessel a name of their own, Shinigami no Kotei, the Emperor of Death. American analysts cross-referenced those documents with intercepted communications from the same period. Each mention of the attacks matched the Harder's known call sign and patrol pattern. There was no doubt left Lewis and his crew had achieved the impossible. Historians pieced together the timeline. April 12th through April 16th, 5 warships destroyed, including 3 destroyers and 2 armed transports, crippling Japan's last defensive line before Okinawa. Even the most conservative estimates called it one of the most lethal single patrols in submarine warfare. When the official report was released in 1946, the Harder's record stood unmatched. Commander Sam Lewis was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross, his citation reading, "For extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty in the face of overwhelming odds." His crew, all 48 men, were collectively commended for valor and self-sacrifice beyond the call of service. The press never printed the full story, too strange, too implausible, too heavy with ghosts. Only a few sentences made it into the public record. Last contact, East China Sea. 5 confirmed kills, lost with all hands. Years later, divers searching the seabed along that same corridor found scattered wreckage, twisted steel fragments that once belonged to Japanese destroyers, now draped in coral and silence. But they found no trace of the submarine itself. No hull, no marking, not even a propeller blade. It was as if the Harder had been erased from the ocean floor. Some said the currents buried her beneath a shifting sandbar. Others believed she had imploded and disintegrated under the immense pressure. Still, the numbers remained undeniable. 5 warships in 4 days, 48 men who never returned. 1 submarine that broke every rule of engagement and vanished without a trace. Naval officers studying the battle years later could only conclude that courage had briefly outweighed probability, and that the sea, in its own way, had chosen to keep the Harder as part of its legend. Today, the coordinates remain marked on U.S. Navy charts, with a single, simple note beside them. Harder missing, but not forgotten. Time has a way of sanding down even the sharpest edges of history, but some stories resist erosion. The Harder's name, once whispered in fear by enemy captains, became a quiet legend among sailors who understood what it meant to fight when the odds had already decided against you. In naval academies, her record was taught not as a manual of tactics, but as a lesson in human will, a reminder that steel and circuitry mean nothing without the men who breathe life into them. Each generation of submariners would pause before deployment to read her log, tracing those last entries as if the words themselves carried strength. In the years that followed, the Navy built faster, quieter, deadlier submarines, each one more advanced than the last, but none bore the same haunted reverence. On calm nights, crews spoke of the Harder as though she still patrolled somewhere beneath the waves, a ghostly guardian of sailors who dared the deep. Some claimed that sonar operators occasionally caught faint rhythmic pulses near her last recorded position. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, the Morse signal for SOS. Others said it was only the sea echoing its memory back to those willing to listen. For historians, her story became a symbol of ingenuity born from desperation. Commander Lewis had rewritten the doctrine of submarine warfare, not through superior technology, but through intuition and courage, proving that victory sometimes belongs not to the best equipped, but to the most determined. His decision to surface and fight defied logic, yet it embodied the truth at the heart of every great act of survival. When everything else is stripped away, resolve becomes its own kind of weapon. Families of the crew gathered each April by the memorial wall at Pearl Harbor, where the Harder's name was carved in quiet bronze among hundreds of others. Flowers floated in the harbor water, drifting in slow circles, as if following unseen currents back toward the East China Sea. Veterans would tell their children that the ocean never truly claimed the men it took. It merely carried their stories farther than any ship could sail. In the end, the Harder's legacy was not the tonnage she sank or the battles she won, but the defiance she embodied, the refusal to accept the limits imposed by fear or reason. Her crew had turned the laws of war upside down and paid for that audacity with their lives. Yet their final act changed how future submariners thought, fought, and remembered. The ocean keeps no monuments, but it remembers courage. Somewhere below that gray horizon, beneath miles of shifting water, lies a silence that still hums with the heartbeat of 48 men who chose to rise when they were meant to hide. Their story remains a testament to an old truth, whispered by sailors across generations, that sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is surface into the storm and dare the sea to take him.